Welcome to Community Chats, bringing you stories and insights from the heart of Community Living Toronto, a non-profit organization that proudly supports people with intellectual disabilities and their families. We will focus on stories of belonging and inclusion and topics of interest from communities across Ontario and the world. From uplifting moments to breaking barriers, from innovative policies to ideas from leading thinkers, we continue to advocate for inclusive communities and support the rights and choices of people with an intellectual disability.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brad Saunders, and I'm the CEO at Community Living Toronto. Welcome to our Community Chats podcast, where we connect with you, members of our community, people who are interested in the topics that we're talking about today. Today, we're recognizing and celebrating Inclusive Education Month, where we recognize the progress that we've made towards more inclusive education in Ontario for so many students across the province. The panel today that we've done, and this is the first time we've actually done a panel on these podcasts, we're joined by Tracey O'Regan, who's a staff at Community Living Toronto, David Lepofsky, who is a member of our Patrons Council and well-known advocate for disability issues in Canada, as well as Stephen MacDonald, who's a teacher with many decades of experience both in Canada and as well as teaching abroad. We talk about a wide range of issues, touching on some of the things that are going really well, some of the improvements that we need to make in the system, and also some tips and helpful guidance for parents and students who are going through the school system. We have a good conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did recording it. All right, we're here today chatting with three experts in the field of inclusive education. They may not see themselves as experts, but we certainly do, certainly people with a lot of experience. And as we know, February is the month that we celebrate inclusive education. And today we want to spend the next half hour or so diving into some of the issues that are currently happening in the field, what's working, what isn't, and how we can each play a role in making it better. So I'm really looking forward to the perspective that each of our panelists has to bring. I'm going to start off by having people introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Tracey O'Regan. Tracey, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Tracey O'Regan, obviously. I'm the program manager currently at Community Living Toronto for Early Childhood Services. I've had the privilege of working with Community Living Toronto. I'm going on 36 years now. So over the time, I've held many different jobs. One of the most, I think, important to me was educational consultant with Community Living Toronto, supporting families and agencies around issues of inclusive education.
Great. Thank you. Stephen.
Okay, thanks, Brad. My name is Stephen MacDonald. I'm the upper elementary lead at Taddle Creek Montessori. As Brad hit on before, I don't view myself as an expert in this field, but I definitely am a teacher with plenty of experience and a lot of interest in doing what I can to improve things. I spent about 15 years living and teaching in Korea before I returned to Canada, and I've been teaching here for about 2 years now.
Great. Thank you. David.
Hi, David Lepofsky. I am chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. We advocate on barrier-free education for all students with disabilities. Since the start of last year, I have been the chair of the Special Education Advisory Committee for the Toronto District School Board, and my vice chair is the phenomenal Tracey O'Regan. I am on the board of Ontario Parents of Visually Impaired Children. I am myself blind. I am a lawyer. I'm a retired lawyer, not taking new cases at all. And I'm a part-time visiting professor of disability rights at two law schools, Western and the University of Ottawa.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Community Living Toronto last year celebrated 75 years. So we're now in our 76th year. And our organization was founded when a grandmother from Scarborough named Victoria Glover wrote a letter to the Toronto Star. And the point of that letter was to complain or highlight the fact that her grandchild could get admission, and this was in 1946, could get admission into the Ontario Hospital School, as it was called then, in Aurelia, and he would be educated. But they lived in Toronto, and that's a long way away, and I'm sure it was even further certainly in terms of getting there in 1946. And her point was, why can't my child go to my local school like every other child in this neighborhood and belong in his community? That's sort of in our DNA as an organization, around community and neighborhoods and people belonging and having accessible education. A lot has happened in the 75, 76 years since Victoria wrote that letter, especially in the field of education. So as we're in Education Month this February, I'd love your perspective from the three of you on where things are at right now with inclusive education. What's your perspective on the field of inclusive education? And maybe David, I'll start with you.
Well, sadly, we're not in a good place. And we're not in a good place, despite the fact that I believe teachers and principals and other educators really want to provide and effectively teach all learners. But we have a school system which for decades, for more than decades, has been designed and operated principally with its target market as students without disabilities. And then when it comes to accommodating the needs and including students with disabilities, we're an afterthought. They give it an unfortunate name, special education. They treat our students as if they're exceptions to the norm. And you're trying to fit, it's like trying to fit your foot into a shoe with a shoehorn that doesn't work and a shoe that doesn't fit. So
Okay.
when we talk about moving towards inclusion in a nutshell, what we need is to be able to ensure that our classrooms are barrier-free physically, the technology, the teacher training, the curriculum. But we don't have that. So we get more resistance to inclusion. And then finally, there are huge bureaucratic barriers, which our special education advisory committee is focused on. It's hard to find out what's available. It's hard to know where to go. The boards don't tell you. It's like a restaurant without giving going to a restaurant that won't give you a menu.
Right. Stephen, what's your thoughts on where things are at with inclusive education?
Well, I agree to a tremendous extent with David, and my experience has reflected that. I will say, having lived abroad, my experience is not only in Ontario, and with that in mind, I have seen tremendous progress, not nearly enough, but I have seen tremendous progress where it's no longer a discussion of whether or not inclusive education is something that needs to take place. It's more of a discussion amongst professionals of how best to practice it in a classroom. But I agree, there are still extant systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Right. Tracey?
Yeah, again, I guess we're all in agreement with, with what David and Stephen said. I think there's, there is the bureaucracy and there, policies and procedures that prevent full inclusion of students with special education needs. I think for me too, there's a mindset, right? Almost like what David was talking about. There's the typical student, which the board addresses their concerns and teachers understand, and even the general public and parents really push for typical students to be successful in school. But students that fall under, like David said, special education needs or have exceptionalities are always considered on the periphery. And I think that's the issue. They're not brought into, when we're planning for schools, like David said, about, even the physical space. But even when we're talking about accommodations and modifications, students with special education needs that may need those necessary accommodations and modifications are really thought of as an afterthought. So for me, there is that mindset that there's still almost like, yeah, we'll get to it, right? And I
Okay.
think that's still a barrier.
So I guess a key driver, certainly in school, sort of kindergarten to grade 12, I guess, the IEP, so which is the Individualized Education Plan, is the key tool, I guess, key planning document around that students with exceptionalities, special needs, complete. And that the IEP, as I understand it, is for any student that has an exceptionality. So it could be somebody that's on a very very intellectual might be going on to sort of advanced studies somewhere else, or people at the other end of the spectrum that might have learning disabilities or an intellectual disabilities or a special need that needs to be accommodated. And that document is really key. It starts from the time someone enters school, it's reviewed every year, and it lays out, Tracey, to your point around what the accessibility and the accommodations might be. Any feedback, or what's your feedback, the three of you, on how effective the IEP is as a tool and what could be done to make it better? And maybe Stephen, I'll start with you. I don't know if you've got the same setup in the Montessori system, but maybe you could speak to your experience there.
Sure. I don't know about other Montessoris, but I can speak to my school. We do use IEPs. And I find them, of course, to be helpful when you're coming into a program fresh, but they're also fairly laborious for the parents and families who are involved in their creation and implementation. So I find them to be sometimes a little bit maybe prohibitive. Prohibitive isn't the right word, but conversations one-on-one and experience with the children you serve, I find to be much more beneficial than just trying to work from the document.
Okay, that's excellent. So it's a combination of having something written, but the more effective piece is the conversation one-on-one with the teacher, with the vice principal, whoever it might be in the school.
And the student themselves, yeah,
The student
absolutely.
themselves, of course. David, what's your perspective on IEPs and how they work and what could be
The
improved?
idea is a good one. The execution is extremely uneven and is fraught with barriers. Here's just a few. First, under Ontario's Education Act, not every child with a disability is entitled to an IEP, even if they have disability-related learning needs. You've all talked about exceptionalities. This is a term that's in the Education Act and its regulations. It's actually quite offensive because it treats our kids as if they're weirdos. They're exceptions from the normal student. But even then, beyond the wording, not all disabilities are defined in our Education Act as exceptionalities, which I believe to be a fundamental violation of the Human Rights Code and the Charter of Rights. So ADHD is not included. Mental health conditions, short of behavior problems, is not included. So if you go to school and say, my child has a mental health psychosocial disability, I want an IEP, you could have the school say no, because the Education Act doesn't provide for it, even though the Human Rights Code requires it. It varies from school to school, principal to principal, bureaucrat to bureaucrat. Then the next problem is the Education Act's regulations require the parents to be consulted, but it doesn't require them to be offered an IEP meeting, a meeting to sit down and have the very conversation Steve just talked about. In the states, that is required. Tracey and I and the rest of our special education advisory committee have been pushing just for the TDSB to offer, the Toronto District School, the school board to offer explicitly to parents, if you want to come in to have a meeting, we'd like to talk to you about what we could put in the IEP. Let's work on it together. The ministry's strategic plan, the school board's strategic plan says they want to approach parents as partners and to remove barriers. But we've been fighting for 8 years, and only this month has the form letter to parents been modified to start to explain this. Those of us who know to ask can ask, and we'll get an IEP meeting, and believe me, it can really help. I'm going to give you a link in the show notes for any parents or others listening to a video I've recorded that I strongly encourage you to watch and share. It's called Tips for Parents of Students with Disabilities on How to Advocate for Your Child's Disability Needs at School. It
Thanks,
really
David.
gives you a roadmap.
Yeah, thanks. I've seen that video. It's really, really well done. Tracey, bit of a different question on that. Now, you, in your role as the education consultant with Community Living Toronto, you worked with a lot of parents around their IEP and sort of engaged with a lot of parents over the years. What's your perspective from that role? How did it work? What were some of the things that you saw work well, that didn't?
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I did a presentation for agencies around the city of Toronto, or I met with parents, and the conversation would go to IEPs, I always started saying very explicitly that I have a love-hate relationship with them, right? It can be a very useful document. I mean, if you read the guidelines through the ministry, it sounds like this is perfect. This will solve everything. The reality goes to what Stephen and David said, though. One, it's not transparent. The process is not transparent. Parents at the TDSB have to really jump through hoops to actually, first of all, get agreement that an IEP is needed for their children. And then it's not even, there's the problem of what accommodations and modifications will be agreed on, but it's the enforcement of the IEP. And that's where it drops a lot. And I speak as this from a parent myself, whose child is on an IEP. And it is the most frustrating, and I'm very well versed, I guess I would say, when it comes to the creation of IEPs. Even for myself, it's a very frustrating experience. And I can share that, it gets to the point where it becomes just a pattern of behavior, right? They know they have to do it. They write something down and then it's never seen again.
It's not
My
meaningful
son, it's not. My son went into grade 10 and they were still refusing to differentiate some of the skills he had learned. And, there was a repetitiveness of just copying the old IEPs. I saw stuff in his grade 10 IEP that was from grade 4. Right. And this is every year going through this, changing it again and again, and promises made. So it's a very frustrating experience. It really is.
My own son is on an IEP as well. He's about to graduate high school. And early on, again, I've been aware of IEPs for years, but early on, I got a call around, confirming the date. And I said, "Oh, I think I'll make it in for that." And they said, no, you don't have to come. And it just shocked me that wasn't even that was a consideration that I didn't have to. I'm not saying they didn't want me, but it was just saying, you don't need to do that. And this is such a fundamental document for a student's career. And does it really fall to the teacher to know the IEP and execute it in the classroom? Is that where sort of the breakdown happens? Stephen, what's your experience?
That has been my experience. Certainly within our organization, I'm able to ask my superiors and colleagues about that if I have questions, but the expectation is that the teacher take on the role of making sure they're familiar with and understand how to implement everything in the IEP.
And I don't want to, sorry, David, I'll come to you. I don't want to come down too hard on teachers. Teachers are great. I mean, both of my kids, we've all had kids in the school system. They educate them well, raise them into thriving young adults. So I want to make sure that we're very fair to teachers, but it's an overwhelming job. You've got 30 students and you've got a lot of stuff going on. It's hard to keep on track of it. So David, what's your experience or thoughts on how to maybe make the IEP more effective?
Well, there's several things. First, we need to require IEP meetings at the front end so that and give families proper rights advice. To explain to them, you can come in here. We want to write this together with you. The next thing is when the draft document is prepared, too many teachers or schools send it home just saying, please sign and return, as if it's a consent form to go on a field trip. It should explain, if you're not happy with any of this, here's who to talk to. But the next problem that Tracey adverted to is parents complaining either that the school wouldn't include something in it that their child needs, or they included something in it their child needs, but they're not delivering on it. Now, we don't know how often that happens because the boards aren't required to audit and make public that data. But what we know, and our Special Education Advisory Committee has been pushing hard on this, is that parents need a fast, effective, fair process to raise concerns within the school board if they're not getting for their child what they believe they need. Now, the parents could end up being wrong or could be misinformed or could be right, but they need a fair hearing. And I don't mean like a lawyer hearing. I mean a fair chance to talk to somebody at the board who's independent of the original decision, who can listen to both sides and maybe say, hey, why don't we do X? The problem is we don't have that. There is a process, a very bureaucratic process. I call it bureaucratic ableism that the ministry prescribed, called the Concerned Parents Protocol, but it's also the place where parents and kids without disabilities go to complain, I don't know, that their kid isn't on the soccer team they want. It's not an expert avenue with people staffing it who have expertise in educating kids
Right.
with disabilities and solving problems. Now, I just want to let you know quickly that we have been pushing for this in our special education advisory committee for years. We passed a detailed motion with recommendations last October. Staff have announced that they've done nothing so far to take steps to implement it. I took it to on the 15th and then the 22nd of January to the Toronto District School Board trustees. I'll give you for the show notes the link to my presenting it. And all that happened as a result was refer it back to staff. The staff who were not prepared to move, and a statement to the media that they're not going to create a new avenue. They're not even going to experiment with it.
Wow.
And that is, I think parents and kids deserve better.
So as I understand now, the current pathway, if you're not satisfied with the IEP or it's not being implemented, is sort of up through the chain of command within the school, right? In our experience, teacher had missed some pieces. You go to the vice principal and go that way.
You go to the principal and then you go to the superintendent. Now you got to remember, it's the superintendent who supervises the principal, may have even been consulted on the decision, so they'll be judging whether their own subordinate or they got it wrong. And none of them may have expertise in educating students with disabilities. They may have taken a course here or there, but that doesn't equate to having extensive experience in the field actually teaching these kids.
So,
and by
Tracey,
the way, sorry, well, the other thing is they may not have the authority to solve it.
Right.
They may be able to call other people on the boards, but they don't have authority to solve it.
Authority, and I would assume also resources at time play into that. There may just not be. Right?
That's a whole huge issue.
Right.
The boards claim they don't have enough resources. The ministry says they're giving them more than ever. We get caught in an ugly verbal tennis match that we could only lose.
Right.
But what we know is even with the resources they've got, they're not doing all they could.
Right. So I want to come to Tracey and Steve, but to start with Tracey around, if the IEP isn't working and parents are feeling that they're not getting their expectations aren't being met, the IEP, or their son or daughter isn't doing well in school, what was your experience in appealing or trying to adjust the IEP in year, or at least in preparation for the next year?
I think it really depends on the principal. It really does. Like that's where I would support people in advocating, because it is a contract, right, between the principal and the parent. The principal is signing it. So it really does depend, like David said, on how familiar with the tool, and I call it a tool, the principal is, and how familiar that principal may be in teaching students with disabilities. Again, though, what we've seen over and over again, and even before I was the educational consultant as a family support coordinator, I would support families at school meetings, IPRCs and IEP meetings and those kinds of things. And, you can't deny it. I mean, going in as, if you are a white educated person, you would probably have more success. There's no question. In my role as educational consultant, there were a lot of families that were newer to the country, newer to the system, that really faced incredible challenges because of cultural backgrounds and those kinds of things. So for me, it was always that one-to-one approach. But it's challenging. It's difficult.
Okay. So Stephen, as a teacher, how do you make sure that the IEP is implemented well within your classrooms or within your schools? What have you seen that works, or steps you take to make sure it's actually being realized, those accommodations inside in a classroom?
Well, not to sound like a broken record, but most of what I do, to the extent that I can, is to, of course, be familiar with it, but also try to converse with the parents of the children who are in the class and find out, because it's not just for me about adhering to what Tracey pointed out as a contract. It's about providing what's needed when it's needed, right? So that means implementing strategies for assistance that might not even be in the most recent version of the IEP that we have.
Right.
So those discussions, like I was talking about before, tend to be much more helpful, although they do place an unfair burden on the parents and the children themselves to kind of bring forward their needs.
So you sort of speak to the relationship that a parent has with a teacher. What advice do you have for parents, or what have you seen in terms of what relationships or what has worked best to collaborate with parents over the years? What works well? What tips do you have for people?
I think being receptive to even possibly what might seem like criticism, bearing in mind that these are, and oftentimes it's the parents who are speaking with us. They're advocating for their children the same way any other parent would, and you need to receive the messages as openly as possible. I don't pretend to not need improvement in that regard either.
As the
but
teacher, receiving,
right,
yeah.
right. But certainly making it as wonderful not wonderful, as great an opportunity as possible for parents to feel that you're approachable and willing to have these discussions as often as need be to create a situation where their student can be successful, their child can be successful.
Okay. I want to move on to other areas, but David, final thoughts on the IEP and suggestions around how for parents who might be struggling with an IEP and have tried a number of things that Tracey and Stephen have suggested, but what the next steps might be?
All the ideas you need are actually in that video I provided. So rather than repeating it all, I'll tell you it provides you with concrete action tips. But the one that's really important that Tracey adverted to is bring allies with you. Ask for a meeting and bring allies, whether it's someone from Community Living Toronto, someone who can help answer the question, what more would you like in here? And if you could come forward and say, we'd like you to include X, and we've got people here who will help you with it. Serve up the solutions on the silver platter so it's easier for them to select it. But tips for videos, or probably tips for parents of students with disabilities. It's on YouTube and it's there for you.
We'll have it in the show notes, and we're happy to plug it. I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm glad you put that together. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just offer you one other thing, and this is beyond the immediate, but we're recording this during a provincial election, and the AODA alliance that I chair is nonpartisan. We do not try to elect or defeat anyone. We try to get as strong commitments as we can from all the parties. We've put out what we're calling the Accessible Ontario Pledge. We want all the parties to make it. So far, the Greens have. We're trying to get the other three parties to do the same. It includes calls for reforms to our education system to make this less a bureaucratic nightmare and easier to navigate. Because that's the road to inclusive education. If you want to learn more about, and we put out a news release the day after the election was called saying that the future for students with disabilities in Ontario is on the ballot in this election. Now, some other people are or parties will try to make it sound like other things are on the ballot, but for us, for over 1/3 of a million students with disabilities and over 2/3 of a million voters who are their parents, this is on the ballot. And you should be pressing politicians of all parties to make commitments. Now, if you want to learn more about all this, just sign up to get updates from the AODA Alliance. Go to www.aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, there's a link for signing up for our newsletter. We'll be giving you action tips.
I've signed up. I've signed up myself. So it's definitely worth doing. I wanted to shift the conversation to talking about transitions for students, because it's such a key aspect of a person's life, a child's life as they're growing. And, even for everybody, it's a very nerve-wracking time, switching schools, meeting new friends. Maybe Tracey, I'll start with you. You're involved in Community Living Toronto's early childhood services, and that really focuses on a transition into preschool childcare. What can you describe what the service is and and sort of what the role of early childhood consultants is in that role?
Yeah, sure. So the resource consultants, they do follow the guidelines from Every Child Belongs, which is from the City of Toronto. And
So
their
just so
role,
just so we're clear, Every Child Belongs is the framework that the City of Toronto uses,
that's correct.
and what's the extent of the framework? Who
Um,
does who does it apply to?
so it would apply to all the centers need to be they need to be involved. Not every childhood center that you see in the City of Toronto is involved within this model. So
Right.
there are centers that are involved in the model. And the resource consultants have a really, really challenging and important role. So they support centers, supervisors will request the support of a resource consultant without a defined disability. So they support any child that there may seem to be some challenges within the center. For those that do have a defined disability, like they have been labeled with a disability,
Diagnosed, yeah.
yeah, diagnosed. They can, in their role, if parents are willing. I mean, it is, again, parents are the leaders in this model, which is why I really appreciate the model. They can support children's transition into kindergarten. And even what their role is to provide as many resources and as much information as they can about, different classrooms, supports that are required. They do talk about IEPs and all those other meetings that are coming up. But their role really is to follow what the parents want.
Okay. Stephen, you're sort of already, so once a person's coming into a childcare center, in your case, Montessori, so they're coming in, that's a big transition, and then also moving out. So you're moving into the, kindergarten, I assume, or grade 1, 2, 3, whatever it might be. What works well? What tips do you have for parents coming in and how they work with their kids to make that transition as successful as possible?
That's a great question. In addition to the opportunities that Tracey mentioned, I really can't recommend enough trying to speak with teachers in advance of entering a classroom if that's possible. And
Mhm.
in my experience, most administrators are willing to allow students an opportunity to come in and be in a class and become familiar with the setting before the school starts. So that can ease the transitions. Planning, I guess, is the key, right? And that includes when you're exiting a school, when you're about to graduate and you need to know what's happening next, right? As the more that we can do to think about and prepare for what's next, the easier the transition will be for the students for sure.
Yeah. Uh, David, in terms of transition, um, graduating out of high school, and options available for students with, let's say, intellectual disabilities, post-secondary, there's not often a lot of options, right? There's pathways into community, there's pathways into employment. The pathways into post-secondary college or a university programs are pretty limited. Any thoughts on sort of how we got there, or what we should be aspiring to for our post-secondary institutions?
Well, again, I can point you to a resource. This is not my field of expertise, so I'm going to have to learn about it later on for family reasons. But we, the AODA Alliance, started in 2009 campaigning for the government to pass a new law, an education accessibility standard under the Disabilities Act, that would detail what needs to be done to make the school system barrier-free for students with all kinds of disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, sensory, the whole community. And it made detailed recommendations regarding transitions, including from school to school, from elementary to high school, switching school boards, and then, of course, on beyond high school. And as we delivered that report, I had the privilege of being appointed to that committee. It's an expert committee that the government appointed that included equal representatives from the disability community and from the education sector. So we were kind of the United Nations of the education disability world. we rendered a detailed report with recommendations in all these areas, and with regard to IEPs, and with regard to unmet needs to accommodate, and so on. And that is
Yeah, yeah.
all. The sad thing is the government received that report 3 years ago in January of 2022 and has not enacted anything.
It's disappointing.
By the way, the other thing, I'm sounding like a source of just more hyperlinks. A lot of families will have heard the term the duty to accommodate that the Human Rights Code, the Charter of Rights
Right.
imposes on schools and colleges and universities, a duty to accommodate your child's disability. What the heck does that mean? I got a video for you on that too. It's just a layperson's introduction to the duty to accommodate. I'll
Great.
give you the link for the show
Thank you.
notes because
Thank you.
people want to know what that means.
Okay. There has been, we work with Community Living Toronto, a lot of parents who were instrumental in making sure that inclusive education and local education became a right in Ontario. And this goes back many decades. In the last number of years, there's been a shift towards more specialized schools, especially for kids on the autism spectrum. And that idea that segregation is more effective or can be more effective in some cases. Do people have any thoughts on that, or what you've seen the benefits of an inclusive education are? And Stephen, maybe I'll start from you. You've worked in different countries and maybe bring that perspective as well.
I think it depends to a great degree on the child in question, as well as what that inclusive education looks like. If, like early in my career, that means pooling grades together with a variety of different disabilities and just essentially babysitting them for the day, then obviously that's not something we
Not
can
ideal,
explore.
yeah.
But no, definitely not. But if it's something that the child is interested in and engages in and is capable of flourishing in that kind of a setting, then I think it's worth exploring. So I understand that the move toward the need for separate opportunities as well. But I've seen in my own experience so much thriving in a classroom where real efforts are made to create opportunities for inclusion.
That's great. Tracey, what are your thoughts, or what have you seen?
I do, again, having been around such a long time, having been through the system myself. I grew up in Toronto, right? So I did grow up in the system. So I see the back and forth, and there is a lot of back and forth, right? You'll see a system that was set up previously where any child that had a disability was automatically segregated into a specialized classroom, whether the parents wanted that or not. And then we saw, a movement, like you mentioned, from those parents, and appreciating that movement, moving in toward a more inclusive classrooms. I think the issue is, all bias. Parents have to choose what's best for their children. I think, first and foremost, I would never, support anybody using their ideology to tell a parent what to do. But I think what's happening right now is when there are so many resources, there is finite resources. And
Right.
so there seems to be, this is where I think a lot of the conflict is. You'll have some people that are wanting more specialized classrooms because of their children's needs, whatever
Right.
those are. And then you'll have a group of parents that want to go to the regular class in their neighborhood school. And it's almost like pitting parent against parent around resources. And what I'm seeing, unfortunately, especially this year, I really started to see it again last year, but this year it's beyond words. Children it's the old-fashioned model of, you want inclusive classroom, great, here you are, dumping children into a regular class, but the supports aren't there,
Yeah.
right? There are no EA supports, SNA supports, like people supports.
Right.
And again, back to your original conversation around IEP and what's accommodation and modification.
Students aren't set up sometimes to
They're
succeed.
not. They're not. And
They
schools are using, methods of exclusion, even though they don't call it exclusion. What we're seeing a lot of is, come pick up your child. Your child can't stay all day. Your child can't stay
or
for so
the slow reintegration, right? Where you come for 20 minutes in the morning and then take them home, and then the next month it's come for 27 minutes.
That's right.
And that we've certainly been involved with some children that's happened to. So you're included and you're intending, they're meeting the letter of the obligation
That's
to
right.
accommodate and include, but they're not actually there for a full day or receiving what could be called an education.
Right. Inclusion is not about dumping a child into a regular classroom and saying we're done.
Yeah.
Right. It is about looking at child's needs.
Yeah. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, let me offer you a few important factors to add to this. Number one, that including a child with a disability, placing them in a regular class where they are sitting in the back, if either excluded altogether and not accommodated, or where there's an EA who's essentially teaching them separately,
right,
is cosmetic integration, but is exclusion by another mean or segregation by another means. The second is your question posited that there's been a move towards more segregated classes. In fact, there are people within other advocacy communities within the education world, especially families of kids with autism, who see that there's an overwhelming trend to try to shut those classes down as much as they can, and a fear that they're doing it supposedly in the name of inclusion when it's really in the name of cost savings.
Right.
And there's a serious fear about that. The third thing you need to know is that when you take a school board like TDSB, which is way more segregated than some other boards from data I saw a few years ago, I went to one of their senior special ed leaders, again, a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, and I said, why is that? They didn't have a clue. They just didn't have a clue. And this is the leadership at the time.
Right.
But we knew one of the reasons, which is that structurally, parents are told, I have been told, your child will get more support in a segregated class. And what parent would say no to that? What parent would say, no, I want my child to get less support? So they don't make the supports portable. If they were portable from the separate class to the regular class, the world could be different. The last two quick points. And this is not all or nothing, and for anything. And I agree with Tracey. We need a range of options. But if you're trying to go from a system of a lot of more segregated classes to more actual real inclusion, we have a problem, which is that school boards and other large public bureaucracies don't have a good track record at transitions.
Right.
Okay, they're better at running the status quo, but transitions risk being really ham-handed. And it's not because anybody's bad, they're just not good at it.
Right.
And the final thing is there is a huge and understandable fear factor on the part of parents whose kids are in a separate class or school. That when the school board says, oh, we're closing your school or your class, but don't worry, next year we're going to provide you here, and it's going to be with the right supports, families who struggle to get their child to where they are, and imperfect as it is, they feel it's the best they can get, feel under incredible siege when they hear that, and they don't believe the party line they're fed. And I don't blame them. What's the solution? Number one, you've got to get school boards to bring in people who know how to do systems transitions, because they don't. And the second thing is, the thing that will satisfy you, the parent, is if they don't say, don't worry, we'll have this alternative placement available next year. If they already have it available this year, and you can go look at it now and try it out for your child.
Go check it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and try it out now with your child, even on a temporary basis.
It's a good idea.
So you could, and if you see it and you go, heck, it works, then you say, okay, I'm comfortable with the move. And if you say it does not work, nice try, then you can say, I've got categorical proof that this would be bad for my child.
Right.
They don't do
That's good.
that.
That's helpful advice, David. Just going to wrap up, and I usually we end with a question: what does belonging mean to you? But I'm going to change that up, given it's Education Month, and we've talked about a lot. But I don't want to. I want to end on a positive note, because there are so many challenges that we face every day. And the question would be: what gives you hope about the future of inclusive education in Ontario? What gives you hope? David, I'm going to start with you.
Parents of students with disabilities are more alive to their rights than they've been and more willing to be active. We need them to be even more active than that. If you sign up to get AODA Alliance updates and get action tips to speak up at all candidates debates, if to answer candidates at the door, what are you prepared to do rather than just promising big bucks like your Santa Claus to actually reform the education system? This is when we have our best chance to get heard, and also
Right.
pressing the media to cover it. We can
Right.
do it, and we can make a difference.
Right. Tracy, what gives you hope?
The same thing as David. It's the parents, right? Parents, like you started this off talking about Community Living Toronto and how it was started by parents. Parents have more power than I think sometimes they realize. Like, I understand everybody's tired, we're working, we're raising children, but parents do have power. And I think parents are starting to realize that again, that they do have a voice, and it makes me hopeful that there are parents getting together and raising their voices.
All right. Stephen, last word to you. What gives you hope about inclusive education in our province?
I hope that three words will be okay.
Of
Um,
course.
in addition to programs like this, and of course, like seeing students thrive who I know in years gone by would not be given that opportunity, those really give me hope. But also seeing, as Tracey and David pointed out, the force that is parents of children with disabilities, and how much of a transformative impact that can have. Our school was, as I understand it, even before I came, transformed by the advocacy and sharing of parents of children with disabilities, and so much for the better.
Fantastic. Stephen, Tracy, David, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today. Your time is appreciated, and really appreciate the work that each of you does in your respective fields around making Ontario a more inclusive place for education. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
thanks for
Thanks for
including
having
us, and thanks for devoting this time to this topic.
Thank you. I want to thank Tracy and David and Stephen for taking time out of their schedules to share their thoughts on the state of inclusive education in the province, and also some tips for parents. I'm sure many of us found that very helpful, and it's good to have their perspective from people that are really involved currently in what's going on. Remember, we release a new episode on the 15th and the 30th of each month, so don't forget to subscribe and stay up to date. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.
Don't forget to join us next time as we unpack the power of community through collaborative initiatives and shared experiences. Available on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Audible, and YouTube. Follow us on social media at CL Toronto. Let's chat, share, and spread those good vibes together. We hope these discussions will inspire you and give new ideas to add your voice to our mission of making our communities and neighborhoods inclusive and welcoming.